In January 1066, England's king died without an heir, and within 12 months, 3 different men had fought for his crown, and the entire ruling class of England had been replaced. This video covers the whole thematic study every exam board sets on Anglo-Saxon and Norman England, the succession crisis, the Battle of Hastings, and the 20 years afterward when William of Normandy had to actually hold on to the country he'd conquered, against castles, rebellions, and a brutal winter campaign that still shows up in the history books today. We'll move through Anglo-Saxon society before the Conquest, the 3 rival claimants, Stamford Bridge and Hastings, the harrying of the North, the new feudal system, and the Domesday Book that recorded it all. Let's start with the England William actually invaded. Every exam board structures this topic the same underlying way, even if the wording differs. First, the succession crisis of 1066 itself. Why 3 men all believed they had a legitimate claim to the English throne, and how that resolved into the Battle of Hastings. Second, how William actually secured the kingdom afterward, because winning one battle did not mean England simply accepted a foreign duke as king. That section covers castles, rebellions, and the brutal harrying of the North. Third, Norman government and society. How landholding, the church, and the machinery of ruling England changed under Norman control, ending with the Domesday Book, the most detailed government survey anywhere in Europe for centuries. Keep that 3-part shape in your head as we go. Claiming the crown, keeping the crown, then transforming the country underneath it. Before 1066, England was already a wealthy, well-organized kingdom, not some backward outpost waiting to be civilized. Society was structured in layers. The king at the top, then powerful earls who governed huge regions like Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria, then thanes, local landowning nobles who owed military service, and finally the ordinary peasants who actually worked the land. The king ruled with the advice of the Witan, a council of the most powerful nobles and churchmen, which could even influence who became king next. England was divided into shires and smaller hundreds for local government and justice, each with its own court, and this administrative system was genuinely sophisticated for its time. Below the thanes, most ordinary people were ceorls, free peasants who farmed their own land and owed labor or produced to a local lord, while a smaller number of slaves existed at the very bottom of society, especially in the earlier Anglo-Saxon period. The economy itself ran on agriculture, wool, and a genuinely busy trading network, with English coins minted to a famously reliable, tightly controlled standard. The country could also raise a FYRD, a part-time army of free men, alongside the housecarls, the king's own professional, full-time soldiers. This was the functioning kingdom that Edward the Confessor left behind when he died on the 5th of January, 1066, with no son to inherit it. Edward the Confessor had ruled England for over 20 years, but he and his wife had no children, which left the succession dangerously unclear. Over the years, Edward seems to have made contradictory signals about who should follow him. English sources claimed that on his deathbed, Edward named Harold Godwinson, his powerful brother-in-law and the Earl of Wessex, as his successor. But William, Duke of Normandy, insisted that back in 1051, Edward had actually promised the throne to him instead, during a period when Edward had close Norman connections from his own years of exile there. Edward had actually spent much of his early life in exile in Normandy itself, after his father was overthrown by Danish invaders, and he only returned to England and took the throne in 1042, which left him with genuine personal ties and political debts to the Norman court. To make matters even more tangled, the Norman sources claim that Harold himself had sworn a solemn oath in 1064 to support William's claim, supposedly after being shipwrecked in Normandy and rescued by William. Whether that oath was freely given or extracted under pressure is still debated by historians, but the Bayeux Tapestry, made by the Norman side, shows it happening in vivid detail. 2 rival stories, 2 very different rightful kings. By early 1066, 3 separate men had genuine reasons to believe England's throne belonged to them. Harold Godwinson was the most powerful nobleman in England itself, immensely wealthy, experienced in battle, and, crucially, actually present in the country when Edward died. William, Duke of Normandy, had that alleged deathbed promise from years earlier, plus Harold's supposed oath of loyalty, and he had the backing of the Pope, who sent him a papal banner to bless the invasion as righteous. And then there was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, a fearsome Viking warlord who based his claim on an old agreement between earlier Danish and English kings that Norway would inherit the throne if the English line failed. Harold Godwinson was also joined, unexpectedly, by an enemy from inside his own family, his exiled brother Tostig, who allied himself with Hardrada out of pure resentment after losing his own earldom. Tostig had actually been driven out by his own Northumbrian subjects in 1065, in a rebellion partly provoked by his own harsh rule, and Harold's decision not to back his brother against that rebellion is exactly what pushed Tostig into Hardrada's camp in the first place. 3 claims, 3 armies, and only 1 crown. Harold Godwinson moved fast. Edward the Confessor was buried on the 6th of January, 1066, in his brand-new Westminster Abbey, and Harold was crowned king that very same day, in the very same building. The speed mattered. It presented Harold's kingship as a smooth, legitimate, almost obvious transition, backed by the Witton's approval, rather than something rushed or contested. But legitimacy on paper didn't remove the danger. Harold knew that both William across the Channel and Hardrada across the North Sea would see his coronation as an act of usurpation, and that at least one of them, quite possibly both, would come to take the crown by force. So for most of 1066, Harold kept much of the English FYRD and navy mobilized along the south coast, watching for a Norman invasion fleet that everyone expected any day. What actually arrived first in September came from entirely the wrong direction. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada and Tostig landed in the north of England with a huge Viking fleet, and on the 20th of September, they crushed the local Earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford Gate, near York. The city itself then surrendered. Harold Godwinson, still watching the south coast for William, now had to react instantly to a completely different threat hundreds of miles away. He marched his army north at extraordinary speed, covering something like 185 miles in only about 4 days, and caught Hardrada's forces completely by surprise at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September. Many of the Viking troops weren't even wearing their armor, having left it back with the ships. The battle was a decisive English victory. Both Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and the invasion was over. Contemporary sources suggest Hardrada's own invasion fleet had originally numbered several hundred ships, and although losses at Stamford Bridge were heavy on both sides, the defeated Norwegians reportedly needed only a fraction of their original ships to carry the survivors home. It was one of the great force marches and surprise attacks in English military history. Harold had barely finished celebrating when the news reached him that a second invasion fleet had landed on the south coast, only 3 days later. William landed his Norman invasion force at Pevensey on the 28th of September, 1066, while Harold was still up in the north celebrating his victory at Stamford Bridge. Harold now faced an almost impossible logistical challenge: march his army roughly 260 miles south, at speed, to confront a second invading force, using troops who had just fought one exhausting battle and hadn't had time to properly recover, restock, or gather full reinforcements from the whole country. He chose to move quickly rather than wait and build overwhelming numbers, partly to stop William's forces from raiding and devastating his own lands in the meantime. By the 13th of October, Harold's army had reached Senlac Hill, near the town of Hastings, and took up a strong defensive position at the top of the ridge. Many historians see this rushed, understrength approach, however understandable given the circumstances, as one of the earliest and most important reasons for what happened the next day. On the 14th of October, 1066, Harold's army formed a tight shield wall along the ridge at Senlac Hill, with his elite housecarls at the center. For most of the day, the Normans below, with cavalry and archers, struggled to break that wall, and rumors even spread at one point that William himself had been killed, until he lifted his helmet to prove otherwise and rally his troops. The turning point came through repeated feigned retreats. Norman cavalry would pull back as if fleeing, tempting undisciplined sections of the English line, especially the less experienced FYRD, to break formation and chase them downhill, straight into a Norman counterattack. Each time this worked, it thinned the shield wall a little more. Late in the battle, Harold himself was killed, traditionally shown in the Bayeux tapestry struck in the eye by an arrow, though some accounts describe him being cut down by knights instead. Norman archers had also switched to firing high into the air rather than straight ahead late in the battle, dropping arrows down behind the shield wall where shields offered far less protection, which may have contributed to Harold's own death. Once Harold fell, English resistance collapsed. Historians generally point to a mix of factors behind William's win: superior tactics and cavalry, Harold's exhausted and depleted army, and simple battlefield luck. It was close enough that a handful of different decisions could have changed the outcome entirely. Winning at Hastings didn't automatically make William King of England in anyone's eyes but his own army's. He spent the following weeks marching towards London, deliberately devastating the countryside to force English submission rather than risk another pitched battle. Key English nobles, including the young claimant Edgar the Atheling, eventually submitted, and William was crowned king in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. Even the coronation itself revealed how fragile the situation still was. When the crowd inside shouted their acclamation in both English and Norman French, the Norman soldiers guarding the abbey outside apparently misunderstood the noise as an attack and began setting nearby buildings on fire in panic. Smoke filled the abbey during William's own coronation. It was a strange, chaotic start to a reign, and a fitting symbol of what was coming. William now technically wore the crown, but actually controlling a hostile, unfamiliar kingdom of over 1 million people, with only a few thousand Norman soldiers, was an entirely different problem. William initially tried a policy of conciliation, keeping some English earls like Edwin and Morcar in place, and confirming some existing landholders, hoping to rule with minimal disruption. It didn't work for long. In 1068, the city of Exeter, backed by Harold's own mother Jitha, rose in open revolt and had to be besieged into submission. That same year, Edwin and Morcar themselves rebelled in the Midlands and North. Meanwhile, Edgar the Atheling, the last surviving male of the old royal line, fled to Scotland and became a rallying figure for continued resistance. Local uprisings, ambushes, and general unrest continued in pockets across the country, particularly in the north, which had always had a more independent relationship with southern English kings and now deeply resented Norman rule on top of that. In 1069, matters escalated dramatically when a large Danish fleet arrived to support the rebels and briefly helped capture York, temporarily wiping out its Norman garrison and giving the rebellion real momentum for the first time. William responded to each rebellion with overwhelming, fast-moving force, but the pattern was becoming clear. Conciliation alone was not going to secure this kingdom, and William needed permanent tools of control, not just battlefield victories that had to be repeated again and again. William's single most effective tool for controlling England was the castle, and specifically the Motte-and-bailey design, a wooden tower on a raised earth mound, the motte, next to an enclosed courtyard, the bailey, all surrounded by a ditch and palisade. Crucially, this style of castle could be thrown up in weeks rather than years, using forced local labor, which meant a small Norman garrison could establish military dominance over a hostile town almost immediately after arriving. William and his lords built hundreds of these castles across England during the Conquest years, at strategic points like London, York, and Warwick, and along contested borders with Wales and Scotland. They served multiple purposes at once: a secure base for troops, a visible symbol of Norman power looming over every rebellious town, and a rapid response point from which cavalry could ride out to crush local unrest before it spread. Historians estimate William and his followers built somewhere in the region of 500 castles across England within about 20 years of the conquest, an extraordinary rate of construction. Many were later rebuilt in stone as permanent fortresses, like the White Tower in London, whose thick walls and commanding position over the Thames were specifically designed to overawe a hostile city, but it was the speed of that early wooden construction that actually won the conquest on the ground. The most brutal Norman response came after 1069, when a serious rebellion broke out in the north, combined with an invading Danish fleet that briefly captured York. William responded with what became known as the Harrying of the North, a deliberate, systematic campaign through the winter of 1069 to 1070 to destroy the region's ability to support any future rebellion. Norman forces burned villages, slaughtered livestock, destroyed stored grain and seed corn, and salted or ruined farmland across huge stretches of Yorkshire and the surrounding shires. Contemporary chroniclers, including the Norman monk Orderic Vitalis, described mass starvation and even wrote that William would answer for the atrocity before God. Modern historians debate the precise death toll, with older estimates running into the tens of thousands and more recent scholarship generally more cautious, but the devastation was clearly severe and long-lasting. The Domesday Book, compiled 17 years later in 1086, still records huge areas of Yorkshire simply as wasta, meaning waste, land producing no value at all. It crushed northern resistance permanently, but it remains one of the most controversial and violent episodes of William's entire reign. Not every threat to William came from Anglo-Saxon resistance alone. In 1075, 3 earls, Ralph de Gale, Roger de Breteuil, and the Anglo-Saxon Earl Waltheof, conspired together in what's known as the Revolt of the Earls, apparently while William himself was away in Normandy. The plot was betrayed and collapsed quickly, without ever seriously threatening William's throne, but the punishments that followed revealed exactly how Norman rule actually worked in practice. Ralph fled abroad, and Roger was imprisoned for the rest of his life, but Waltheof, the only one of the 3 who was actually English, was executed, making him the sole English Earl William ever put to death. To some, this showed William applying the same harsh justice regardless of nationality. To others, it showed that an Englishman's loyalty was never fully trusted the way a Norman's was, and that execution sent a clear message about where real power now sat. Either way, the revolt confirmed that England's new Norman aristocracy, not just the conquered English, needed constant watching too. The most famous individual resistance fighter of the whole conquest was Hereward, later nicknamed Hereward the Wake, an Anglo-Saxon noble who led a guerrilla-style rebellion from the Isle of Ely, a naturally defended stronghold deep in the marshy fens of eastern England. In 1071, Hereward's rebels were joined by other prominent figures, including Earl Morcar and a Danish fleet, turning Ely into the last serious concentrated center of English resistance anywhere in the country. The site's watery, boggy terrain made a conventional siege extremely difficult, so William's forces reportedly had to construct a special causeway across the marshes just to reach the rebel stronghold at all. When Ely finally fell, most of the rebel leaders were captured or made peace, though sources disagree about Hereward's actual fate, with some later legends claiming he was eventually pardoned and even accepted into William's service. Whatever really happened to him personally, Ely's fall in 1071 effectively marked the end of large-scale, organized English military resistance to the Norman conquest, 5 years after Hastings. Beyond castles and military force, William's most transformative act was the near-total replacement of English landholders with Norman ones. Land belonging to rebels, or simply confiscated as a matter of policy, was redistributed to roughly 200 of William's most trusted Norman followers, who became tenants-in-chief, holding their land directly from the king. In exchange, these tenants-in-chief owed William a fixed quota of knights for military service whenever he needed an army, and they in turn divided up portions of their own land to subtenants, who owed the same kind of service further down the chain. This pyramid structure, historians often call it the feudal system, bound the entire landholding class together through personal oaths of loyalty and military obligation, all ultimately owed to the king himself. The scale of the change was staggering. By the time of William's death in 1087, something like 95% of land in England that had belonged to English lords before the conquest was now in Norman hands. Land was formally forfeited through a legal process built around the idea that rebels, or even those who simply failed to actively support William quickly enough, had broken their duty to their new king, giving William a convenient justification for redistributing almost anything he wanted. It was one of the most complete transfers of wealth and power in English history, achieved in barely 2 decades. The new Norman aristocracy that replaced English lords lived a very different kind of life, centered on the castle, the hunt, and constant military readiness rather than the older Anglo-Saxon model of local, settled land ownership. Along the dangerous and unstable borders with Wales and Scotland, William created special marcher earldoms at Chester, Shrewsbury, and Hereford, granting their earls unusually broad, almost independent powers to defend the frontier and expand Norman territory into Welsh land largely on their own initiative, without needing constant royal permission. This was a deliberate trade-off. William accepted less direct control over these particular lords in exchange for a defended, expanding border that didn't require his personal attention. Elsewhere, a Norman lord's status rested on holding an honor, a scattered collection of manors and estates across the country, deliberately spread out by William rather than concentrated in one region, which conveniently made it much harder for any single Norman lord to build a rival power base and challenge the king directly. In return for their honor, tenants-in-chief owed the king a fixed quota of armed, mounted knights, known as a knight's fee obligation, whenever William needed to raise an army, which is precisely the military logic binding the entire feudal pyramid together underneath all the ceremony and land. Norman power in England was real and enormous, but it was also carefully, deliberately fragmented. William treated the English Church as another institution requiring firm Norman control, and change came quickly. In 1070, Stigand, the existing Archbishop of Canterbury, was deposed on the grounds that his appointment had been uncanonical in the first place, and replaced with Lanfranc, a respected Italian scholar and monk from Normandy. Over the following years, most English bishops and abbots were gradually replaced by Norman appointees as they died or were removed, and Lanfranc pushed through genuine reforms, separating church courts from secular ones for the first time, cracking down on the buying and selling of church positions known as simony, and encouraging clerical celibacy in line with wider European reform movements. Physically, the Norman Church left an unmistakable mark. Enormous new Romanesque cathedrals and abbeys at Canterbury, Durham, and elsewhere were built in a distinctly continental architectural style, often quite literally on top of demolished Anglo-Saxon churches. Yet plenty stayed the same underneath the new leadership. The basic parish structure, local worship, and the tithing system that funded the church all continued largely unchanged for ordinary English people. Lanfranc also pushed a significant wave of monastic reform, encouraging stricter discipline in existing English monasteries and founding new Norman-style religious houses, which brought continental scholarship and continental church politics much more directly into English religious life than before. For all the violence and upheaval elsewhere, William's approach to actual day-to-day government was surprisingly conservative. He largely kept the existing Anglo-Saxon administrative machinery running, rather than replacing it wholesale, because it was already genuinely effective at raising money and enforcing order. The shire and hundred court system continued, as did the practice of royal writs, short, sealed written instructions used to communicate the king's orders quickly and precisely across the kingdom. The office of sheriff, the king's chief representative and enforcer within each shire, became even more important under Norman rule, though the men holding the job were now almost exclusively Norman rather than English, forming a crucial link between royal authority in London and local government far from it. England's sophisticated Anglo-Saxon tax system, based on an existing land assessment called geld, was likewise kept largely intact and simply redirected to serve Norman interests. William also relied heavily on itinerant kingship, physically traveling constantly around his territories in England and Normandy alike with his royal household, since there was no single fixed capital or permanent seat of government yet capable of running the kingdom on its own. This pattern, dramatic, often brutal change at the top, layered onto real continuity underneath, is one of the most important things examiners want you to be able to explain and evaluate. One of the most deeply resented Norman innovations was forest law, an entirely new legal category that had nothing to do with actual woodland and everything to do with royal hunting rights. William designated huge areas of the country, including farmland and existing villages, as royal forest, land reserved specifically for the king's own hunting of deer and other game. Anyone living within these zones now faced severe new restrictions and brutally harsh punishments, including blinding or castration, for offenses like killing a deer, clearing land, or even carrying a bough within the boundaries, regardless of who had actually owned or farmed that land beforehand. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself bitterly condemned William for this, famously writing that he loved the tall deer as if he were their father. Forest law struck many ordinary English people as a uniquely arrogant symbol of Norman tyranny. It prioritized one king's personal hunting pleasure over the basic livelihoods of entire communities, and it survived, in various harsh forms, for generations after William's own death. The most famous example, the New Forest in Hampshire, is traditionally said to have involved clearing existing villages to make room for royal hunting grounds, though historians still debate exactly how much settlement was actually displaced there. Forest law became one of the longest-lasting and most hated legacies of the Conquest. In late 1085, William commissioned an astonishingly ambitious project, a complete survey of nearly the entire Kingdom of England, recording who held every piece of land, how much it was worth, and exactly what resources it contained, right down to the number of plows, mills, fisheries, and even individual peasant households. Royal commissioners fanned out across the country in 1086, gathering sworn testimony from local juries in each area, and the results were compiled remarkably quickly into what became known as the Domesday Book. Historians still debate its exact original purpose. It was almost certainly used to assess and maximize royal tax revenue, but it likely also served to settle land disputes after 2 decades of confiscation and resettlement, and to create a permanent, authoritative record of exactly who owned what under the new Norman order. The nickname itself came from ordinary people who compared its judgments to the biblical Last Judgment, or Doomsday. Once your land was recorded in the book, there was no appeal and no escaping it. The whole survey was organized into regional circuits, with teams of commissioners visiting groups of counties, cross-checking testimony from local juries against existing tax records to catch any discrepancies or attempted evasion. No government in Europe would attempt anything on this administrative scale again for centuries. So, how much did the Norman conquest actually change England, and how much stayed the same? For a long time, historians favored what's sometimes called the Norman yoke interpretation, the idea of a free, relatively democratic Anglo-Saxon society brutally crushed and replaced by a harsh, foreign, feudal tyranny imposed from above. There's real truth in parts of that picture. The scale of land seizure, the harrying of the north, and forest law were all genuinely brutal. But most historians today argue for a more balanced view. Norman rule was built directly on top of an already sophisticated Anglo-Saxon system of shires, sheriffs, and royal writs, rather than inventing English government from scratch. What changed most dramatically wasn't necessarily how England was governed on a daily basis, but who was doing the governing, and how completely that new Norman elite replaced the old one at the very top. The conquest also left a lasting linguistic legacy. Norman French became the language of the court, the law, and the aristocracy for generations, while English survived among the ordinary population, and the blending of the two over the following centuries eventually helped shape the English language you're actually listening to right now. This continuity versus change debate, and the reasons behind whichever position you take, is exactly the kind of evaluation exam boards love to test directly. So remember the whole arc: a succession crisis with 3 legitimate-seeming claimants, resolved through 2 battles in barely 3 weeks, followed by 20 years of William fighting to actually hold onto what Hastings had won him, through castles, brutal repression, and a complete replacement of England's ruling class. If you remember one thing for the exam, remember that winning the crown and keeping the crown were 2 entirely different problems, and most of this topic is really about the second one. That's the whole thematic study, in about half an hour. This video is part of our GCSE History playlist, 1 full topic per video, covering every major exam board in one place. Subscribe for the next one, and good luck in the exam hall.